Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Birk Weiberg, and I'm here today with my co-host Stephanie Breuer for the second Conversational Technologies talk from the Lucerne School of Design, Film and Art. And in these talks, we invite artists, designers, and scholars to help us understand how generative AI is changing creative practices and how the current developments relate to the ongoing entanglement of humans and machines. Last time we talked about images. Today we will learn more about texts in this regard. Some quick housekeeping remarks. We are recording this event, so please keep your mics muted. If you feel comfortable with leaving your camera on, we appreciate that. It's always nicer to see people in these talks, but you can, of course, keep the camera off. We will begin with a presentation, then Stephanie and I will start the discussion, and at the end, we will open up for your questions and comments. This series of talks is organized by our Creativity and Digitality Hub in partnership with different degree programs. The Creativity and Digitality Hub is a recently established initiative to promote research into and with new technologies in the arts. And today's talk is being jointly organized by the Hub and our Digital Ideation Bachelor program. And I'm happy to pass the virtual microphone over to Stephanie to tell you more about digital ideation and to introduce our guest, Hannes Bajohr.
Thank you very much, Birk. I would like to start with a couple words about the bachelor program, Digital Ideation, which is basically the combination of computer science and design. It's really important for us that the students tackle their projects not just like following like a strict curriculum, and rather it's a project-centered approach. They work in interdisciplinary teams and thereby also learn from each other. And there's different possibilities for going deeper into the subjects of digital ideation, such as web and mobile. Another focus is on user experience, and also game design is a possible focus. The students, after graduating, work in fields as diverse as game design, graphic design, UX design, interaction design, web design, or web development. Also, huge thanks to you, Hannes, for taking the time today, for giving us an insight into your work. I'm introducing you with a few words, and feel free to just add anything that I skimmed over too quickly. But I want to highlight a couple of things that I think will be interesting for everyone here in this Zoom room to know about you. You are professor since this year at the Department of German at UC Berkeley, after having studied and conducted research in Berlin, in New York, in Basel, in Zurich. You finished your PhD degree at the Columbia University in New York City, and your PhD was on Hans Blumenberg's theory of language. You have a vast array of research interests. They include theories of the digital literature and generative AI, and German 20th century history of philosophy and political theory. Currently, you are working on a project about post-artificial writing, and I think we will learn a bit more about that during our event today. What is also important to note is that you are both a theoretician and a practitioner of digital literature. Today, we mainly focus on your practice, on your literary production. And since by now 10 years, you've been part of a writers collective, which I'm hesitant to pronounce. Maybe it should not be pronounced. I'm going to give it a try. Let's call it 0x0A, together with Gregor Weichbrot. And the two of you develop digital conceptual literature, and you have published generative works such as Durchschnitt, which can be translated to English as average. It's from 2016, and there you work with a Python script, and you systematized canonical German novels, and it's yeah, maybe it can be called like an insight into these novels, but in a very systematized way. Another project a year afterwards, 2017, is Germania Markoviana, where you operated with Markov chains to emulate the sentence structure and thereby also the tone of right-wing authors. Again, a year later, 2018, you published Halbzeug. That's a collection of poetry, and it got published in the Surkamp publishing house. Independently from the collective, last year you published Berlin, Miami, and there you used GPT-J and GPT-Neo-X, which you trained on 4 novels of contemporary literature, and you used next token prediction to generate a novel sentence by sentence. Maybe we will learn a little bit more about that during your presentation. And again, thank you very much, Hannes. We are very curious about your presentation.
Thank you. I will share my screen, and I think you should be able to see it now. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you for the introduction, Birk and Stephanie. So I will talk about my practice as a writer who works with computational techniques, and then we can discuss this if you have questions. I mean, I will mostly talk about the poetics behind it, the conceptual assumptions, a little bit about the technology, but I'm happy to go either direction afterwards. So as you mentioned, I'm an author of digital literature. That is, my practice is the manipulation of language by digital means. And I stress this field or this area as literature and not as art or as visual art, because there's, I think, a very specific framework of references when it comes to literary practices that are a little more narrow, I think, than the visual arts. I can give you a slide. So these are some of my books. These are not all, but I have worked in German and in English. Most of these are actually in German, I believe. Blanks is the translation of Halbzeug. Timidities was in English. Monologue was in English. Renga Anger, which came out with a Edition Taberna Critica in Bern, is in 4 languages, and the rest are in German. And yeah, I work both individually under my own name, but also with Gregor Weichbrot as part of the text collective, we called it, for digital conceptual literature, OXOA, which is the the character for the line feed. So it's a control character that you can't actually speak. You can't speak what it does. Before I discuss what digital literature is, or as the way I understand it in general, I want to preface this by saying that it is more than using AI. I think AI has become a shorthand for digital writing since the rise of ChatGPT, and I want to stress that there's a long history before this, a history of what you could call generative literature, that is producing text by means of scripts, programs, rules. And I think the recent interest in writing technologies after ChatGPT sometimes forgets that. So I like to stress this. Of all the books that you see here, only the novel Berlin, Miami was produced using a large language model. The other ones use other technologies. So let me start by saying what it is that I do. What is digital literature? Or at least, what is it that I understand it to be? I would say digital literature is literature created or shaped significantly by computational tools. Often that does not mean anything too out there. Certainly, it's not a matter of technical virtuosity. I think that's important. The simple things sometimes can be the best. So, for instance, using computational tools, not merely passively and incidentally, like you would if you use Microsoft Word, but addressing their inherent affordances is at the heart of digital literature. So again, Word would not be enough, but for instance, using the synonym function of Word in some creative way might be. And this is what I did in some in one part of Halbzeug, which is, again, a very, very simple process that one might even hesitate to call computational, but it is about the digital tools that produce the text. What you see here is the poem Corona by Paul Celan, and my version, which is called Kranz, which was produced by replacing every noun, adjective, and adverb through the word synonym function. So it is kind of a translation that shows the way word processes language and understands language. Another example from Halbzeug, here's the English translation from blanks, is using 5 grams. 5 grams, n-grams are a way of ordering text corpora, and it means the n most frequent successive words. In this case, 5 grams are the 5 most frequent successive words that from the corpus of Kafka and Goethe. And by using this ordering technique, there's kind of a production of material that I can then use and rearrange. In this case, it is Kafka, Goethe, and then the other way around. One of the main elements of what I do in my practice is what I call writing at a distance. So authors of digital literature don't write texts, but set up assemblages, codes, algorithm rules, and sometimes prompts that then create the final text. So this process shifts the role of the author. It foregrounds concepts and material manipulation, and often making the creation or the process of creation as significant as the actual output. So I want to offer a few elements of what I consider necessary for something to be digital literature. And again, this is maybe more my definition. If you want to read more about this, there are 2 books. One's coming out, both in German, Digitale Literatur zur Einführung, and the other one is my Poetikvorlesung in Hildesheim that came out 2 years ago. So I already mentioned that the element of distance is important. The author steps back, creating mechanisms rather than directly crafting the text. The examples could include the synonym-based poetry that I showed, or the 5 grams. Another one is the maybe more traditional generative writing that begins in the 1950s. And I think the very first writing, the very first text that one would consider digital literature is from 1952. It's Christopher Strachey's Love Letters, which were created on a Manchester Mark I. Strachey, a colleague of Alan Turing, wrote a simple slot and fill mechanism. So a template that then would be filled by adjective, nouns, adverbs, and verbs from a list. And they would create these love letters that are then signed MUC, Manchester University Computer. This is the very first one. However, if distanced writing, if setting up kind of a system of rules to produce text can be understood as a kind of the basic idea of digital literature, then we can go much further back in history. We could go back to the Baroque. Georg Philipp Harsdorff's Fünffacher Denkkrieg der deutschen Sprache is a very famous example, which is a setup of 5 concentric rings with what you might call phonemes that you could turn to produce new sentences. So this is a combinatorial process for what in rhetoric you would call the inventio stage. Another example of an analog but rule-based type of poetry would be Raymond Queneau's 100 milliards de poèmes. That is a set of 10 individually leafable sonnets where each line can be interchanged with any other and it still rhymes, and then you get to that number of poems. So these would be examples of distanced writing where you don't put text to paper, but you build a machine that produces the text. The second element that I think is important is the use of material. Instead of coming up with something new out of thin air, which is the stereotypical act of creation in writing, digital literature reuses and repurposes existing data as raw material for new texts. Examples, again, could be the using Paul Celan's text as a basis, or another one is you scrape text from the web, which is what I did for my book Timidities. One text there is called Monologue, and it scrapes all letters to the sex advice column by Dan Savage called Savage Love, and takes the sentences that begin with I am, which always are kind of a definitory statement, and puts all these together in one long monologue, hence the term. So here using the material to create the text is kind of most of the work already. Finally, all of this comes together in something that one could call concepts. There is a need for a conceptual framing because the guiding idea is at least as important, if sometimes not more, than the final text itself. Creating a framework for the text to make sense, given what we know about its distance make and its material origin, is important to understand it. For instance, here in the 5-gram text, you see at the bottom that I give a short description of how it was done. The reason for this is that these works require a little more explanation because they're not to be taken at face value. I mean, you can read it as a poem, but I think you get only half of it if you don't know how it is made. If we see a poem, usually we know how to read it. It is an introduced, an established genre in our culture. But if we encounter an experimental text, often the immediate reaction is confusion if the explanatory frameworks are absent that show the difference between a text like this and a conventional poem. So I think this explanation is essential for engaging with the works conceptually and aesthetically then. And finally, I think there is a dual function that digital literature has. It exists at the intersection of aesthetic exploration and analytic critique, offering insights into language systems and digital culture. And one way to put it is that it is consists of aesthetic arrangements with an epistemic goal. To understand, one way of putting it, the system that produced the text. For instance, how does a word processor like Word conceive of language, of the relation between different types of words and so on. All these points, distance, material, and concept, and the dual function of literature also play a role in writing with AI, but at the same time, they produce problems and resistances that I, as a writer, feel had to confront and kind of overcome. So what happens to these three elements? The distance is in AI writing increased again. If you have in the old model, and the model I just showed, you write a text that writes a text, right? You set up rules that then produce a final text. AI introduces another level of distance. The author trains or selects the AI model, trains or selects the data set, which then generates the text. So the final output emerges from layers of mediation, from writing a text that writes a text, then to selecting a training set that extracts its salience features by itself, and so on. So we have an increased distance. I call it tertiary or even quaternary authorship. The material basis is larger, and it is to a large degree inscrutable. Large language models use training data that is much bigger and harder to keep track of than the material of classic digital literature, right? Even if I use the whole corpus of Kafka at Goethe, this is peanuts compared to what GPT, for instance, is fed as a training set. In such pre-trained models as GPT, the exact origin of the training set is another matter because it's very often not clear. It is harder to make the material the topic of a work in the way that I did, for instance, in the Kafka Goethe text, because this material hides and naturalizes itself. I mean, the whole point of large language models is to become a type of natural speaking, a natural speech that does not show itself being based on training data. And finally, concepts are much harder to control. Traditional digital literature relies on deterministic processes. You have algorithms that once executed, always produce the same output. You have rules that you can follow that are deterministic. But the AI writing and large language models introduce statistical models like neural networks that generate unpredictable and often non-reproducible outputs. Again, all of this is run on computers, so they could be reproducible, but features like temperature and top K sampling and so on make it so that in practice it is not. And all of this leads to a different poetics. The relationship between material concept and output is then transformed. Instead of directly shaping the output, authors influence it indirectly through data selection and training parameters. AI-generated text, therefore, often, which is kind of a shame, celebrate their black box nature, contrasting with traditional digital literacy emphasis on transparency and reproducibility. One example of this would be the novel, it's fairly well known now, Pharmaco AI by K. Alado McDowell, who co-wrote a novel with, I think it was GPT-3 at the time, in which he separates the different roles by showing in bold and in normal font who wrote what. But it is very much an obscurantist, or maybe you could call it like a tech new age text. It celebrates this kind of the genius of the machine, the inability to really tell where things come from, and I'm a little I'm a little wary of that. I think there's it lacks a certain critical distance that I would like to keep. My own attempt at writing a novel with AI is still in Miami. It is AI generated, created using custom trained large language models, GPT-J and Neo-X, as Stephanie said. And the project investigates the aesthetic, epistemic, and conceptual implications of literature created by AI. The question for me was, how can one still make sense of the technology through the medium of literature if it becomes harder to control and so much more opaque? The concept was, well, if the only thing that we still have to shed light on the black box are maybe the glitches and the errors that the text of the machine produces. So if we let the machine speak and see what it says, we can see what we can learn about the process behind it. The material so it is fine-tuned. The model is fine-tuned on 4 contemporary novels that for literature critic Elias Kreutzmeier represent the literature of the digital society, as he says. And then GPT-J and Neo-X are trained on this corpus. So fine-tuning means the model is not trained from scratch, but a model that already speaks German, so to say, is given a specific voice by these 4 novels. And finally, at the level of distance, the generating of the novel was done not via an abstract prompt, as you would do in ChatGPT. You say, write me a novel or write me a story or something like that, but rather by next talk and prediction, by giving it something to start from. And if it's just a letter, or if it's just a quotation mark, it would then produce character by character, token by token, the next sentences. There was little intervention, but not none. I had to sometimes change course of the text because the context window is limited. So sometimes I had to reintroduce certain topics. But I also have to say, tempted to explore the vector space a little bit. One could say that all the books are still present in the model, not as a collage, but kind of as a style or a mood or a vibe. And at the same time, they are exploded in their coherent worlds, right? So that was something that I found quite interesting. And you can then ask questions to this model. You can introduce topics that you want to hear more about. And another point was that literary critic Angus Fletcher claimed that AI in principle cannot narrate, because narration is stringing together causal claims, whereas AI or language models as statistical machines are incapable of causal reasoning. They only deal with correlations. One way to think of this is that LLMs operate on the basis of links between probable, that is statistically relevant, character sequences. So certain words or phrases are very likely to be followed by other words and phrases. However, this says nothing about whether they have a cause and effect relationship. For instance, the words smoke and fire very often appear together in text. They are correlated, but whether the fire is the cause of the smoke or vice versa, the AI does not know per se. Nevertheless, the output will be correct in the first instance, but only because it is probable. So to test whether AI can narrate is also a goal of Berlin, Miami. I said that. I want to close by reading two short excerpts from the book. You can see them here in German. I will read them in English from a translation of an excerpt that was published recently. And this is actually the very first, it's not the first text in the book because I rearranged some of them, but it's the first text that I ever generated with this novel, with this model, and the one that made me want to write the book as a whole. As a child, I had a set of teeth that displayed an unconventional division between a jawling and a pond head. The jawling was rooted in strength, the pond head solidified by an extremely slender base that pulled the jaw out of the jawling at the same moment its legs shook. I surmised that the jawling's legs had bitten into the indifferent pond head to manifest, in this immediate gesture, a future of communion, not only in the sense of a possibility, after all, so many people were already there, but also through getting all other grips, through the gridding of their own layers, through an uncomplicated combination of bowel and sweat gutters, through the counter-shoeing of hundreds of valuable experiences, through the multiplication of progress. Of course, I didn't care about any of that. Its sharpness, its hardness, its strength, all the things I had forever cherished were too decided for me. As a child, therefore, I consciously and with my own eyes saw the path that the human body shape takes towards suicide. That's how I understood what had happened to my father. So here you see this kind of production of meaning on a surface level that I find absolutely fascinating, which also made the writing experience interesting. It is the exploration of a vector space, of some kind of potential of meaning, which gives the kind of the impression of a certain type of co-authorship that is going on. You see while you write what you write a little bit from the outside. You're not in the driver's seat, but maybe you're more on the back of a horse that moves by itself. I also became a little less strict with conceptual purity and then allowed myself to follow certain traces. At one point, I learned that the jawling, the kieferling, can get pregnant. So I typed in jawling pregnancies and got the following. Jawling pregnancies result from the interaction of several gene mutations, that is, when two pairs of gene variants with behavioral problems combine in one germ cell. My father had originally bought the jawling from the Institute of Psychology in Vienna. He was one of the people who led this research effort. He was a researcher into relief, anger, and self-defense. And he wasn't just any father, as far as I know, but a nice man who, however, constantly wanted to stare at the screen, its crucial information and forums that were all about explaining the one question he was so passionately interested in: why humans love humans. This was something he couldn't understand. It was a huge problem for him. He saw jawlings as proof that humans had not only come to the surface of nature through non-biological evolution, but that there were also genetic factors that made humans interested in other humans. A research group from Canada had found in a study that people with certain variants in the gene for tyrosine syndrome, that is, people with auburn hair, were prone to depression. They found that people with auburn hair were significantly more likely to be depressed than people with blonde hair. The jawling appeared to him as a kind of expression of this research, as a confirmation for my father, because the jawling, too, had auburn hair. And you see here kind of what appear to be logical conclusions on the surface of the narration, but in fact don't really make sense, right? There is no there's no clear connection between the premise and the conclusion there. And the reading experience then becomes one of, which I find I read the book at least 3 or 4 times now. And the reading experience is really one of an increasing distrust. There is kind of coherence over long stretches, which then collapses, and you always expect the next sentence to do exactly that, to collapse into nonsense. And there's a lot of contradictions. But at the same time, there's also a hope for meaning. And what I call surface narrative or surface narration is kind of what this experience is. And at the same time, you are the one creating the coherence in the reading process. So I found the most pleasurable way to read this is to kind of almost squint a little bit and let it just happen, and then maybe something like enjoyment might result. Okay, I think I'm at about 20 minutes now. I'll stop here, and then I'm happy to discuss the text and the basics for it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Hannes. I found it very helpful that you contextualized the AI literature with this brief history of digital literature. And maybe I can start with a question. What I found interesting is that at the very beginning, you very much separated literature or digital literature from any approach in visual arts.
Mm-hmm.
But how you explained digital literature, I mean, the distance, how material is used, and this conceptual approach, it reminded me a lot on modernist fine arts in a lot of ways, you know. I mean, if we think about painters who really try to create the very abstract painting that is basically flat, that doesn't try to create any illusion. So this very short description of modernist fine art in that way. So how would you separate that? I mean, in its aim, do you try to understand what is text itself, or where is the difference? How is it related to this modernist approach?
I say that obviously there's also modernist ways of writing, but what I mean is that the framework of values and criteria for judging a work like this must come from literature rather than a wider assumption of art or a wider context of art. And I think what very often happens is that people from visual arts have absolutely no problem with writing like this. Right, it is a type of production that is very much in line with certain techniques of found material, collage, etc. Whereas for people from literature, it becomes a problem sometimes, and there's this very often a skepticism towards experimental processes in literature itself, and I think this is why I highlight this, because if it produces problems or difficulties, it is mostly for the framework of literature. At the same time, I want it to be read as literature, right? And because there's a lot of examples of bookmaking by visual artists. I mean, you have the bookworks, but also, for instance, someone like what was her name again? Who used a neural network trained on the Bible to produce a new Bible, Laurie Anderson, which is exhibited as a book in a single edition in an exhibition. It is not a work of literature; it is a work of art. Right? Maybe this is a little bit just some kind of my private obsession with these differences, but I always said that at the beginning. This has to be understood as a literary work.
Okay, now I understand.
I would like to ask about the notion of post-artificial writing. Could you please connect it to what you described at the end of your presentation about how reading and understanding somehow gets more important than writing? Thank you.
Right. But the idea of post-artificial literature or post-artificial writing is that at a point when we can no longer see immediately the way a text was made, whether it was kind of written conventionally or naturally, or if it is an artificial or synthetic text, we suddenly see two things. The first one is we understand that there is a standard assumption that every text that we encounter is written by humans. This only becomes visible once there's an alternative to it. And then there is a sudden doubt that is introduced. And I think we're already in the situation that whenever we see something, we might ask ourselves, has this been created using AI or not? And this is what I speculate about in a text, that at one point this doubt is no longer tenable, and then we might move to what I would call a post-artificial way of understanding text that basically ignores the question or is agnostic as to the origins of a text and simply looks at the readerly impressions it makes on us. So it is in a way a realization of a lot of post-structuralist theory about authorship, that the reader really is the one producing the work. I'm teaching a class right now about this, and it's very interesting to hear the discussions of my students about the ideas of authorial intent and the inference as to authors' kind of plans and motivations and so on. And what I found interesting is that this is exactly what is discussed now in relation to AI text. Right? You have a lot of very smart people insisting that AI text is inherently meaningless because it lacks some kind of intentional structure behind it, which I find surprising, but maybe also not, in the sense that what we've learned from Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault about the way authorship has changed has always been aspirational. It has never been a real. It has always been a position of reading for very, very limited and professional readership, namely mostly people from literary studies, which now might become a more widespread way of reading, simply because we cannot be sure that there is someone behind it who means, who intends. So that is kind of the idea of the post-artificial.
I mean, this mixture of reader and author, I mean, it's very prominent in your production of Berlin, Miami. How aware were you? I mean, I'm not sure if that's clear right now for everybody. You mentioned it briefly, this next token prediction. So you start a sentence with a letter or something. Yeah. But I mean, you're not traditionally anymore the author. You're basically the first reader and the first critic or something. How aware were you of this switching there or this swapping when you started that process?
Oh, very. I mean, it is a very different experience of writing. It is one really that is distance, and some in another sense, in that you are watching the text being produced before your eyes. You become the first reader, but you also there's still clearly a level of authorship there, insofar as my first reading is not anybody else's first reading, because I am able to intervene still, right? I can say, okay, this is going on for too long, or I will stop this here now. So there's this sense that my first reading is also still an act of writing, which is different from my second reading, right? When the text is done and I read it, then I think there's a lot more of the interpretive kind of the production of meaning by reading it for myself is somewhat more active there, because the text is done. The text is already something that I have to contend with, rather than something I might be able to change later.
Another question that came in my mind about your writing practice is that, I mean, you're producing literature and you're writing scholarly texts about literature. How much do you keep these things apart? I mean, do you use the same tools for writing? Did it change your scholarly writing that when you're switching to programming and writing a Python script? So is there any overlap or something that influences each other? Or
I think that all my writing wants to explore some questions. So I think there's like an epistemic goal there, but the techniques are quite different. I think I write very conventionally and traditionally when I write scholarly texts. So I wouldn't use an LLM to produce that, because I do still think that texts that I want to write in a scholarly capacity are thoughts, in a way, that I want to be in control of. So I believe very much in writing as an externalization of thought. This is also something I talk about with my students, that you can use ChatGPT to write an essay, but it is not a product of thought anymore. It is the product of a certain it is a shortcut to a large degree. So when I write an essay or some other nonfiction text, I'm not always sure that I know what I want to say, so I need the process in order to think, which is very different from these kind of things, because I want to be surprised. I want to be surprised by what the result is of a process in which, to some extent, I give up control. So it becomes maybe the difference is something like trying to get to a goal in scholarly writing and trying to explore a certain space in literary writing. And these are different goals, even though the exploration of the space and the putting down of thoughts both have some kind of epistemic goal, maybe to learn about something.
We talked about Berlin, Miami, which you produced with the help of this large language model, but you also mentioned that actually the bulk of your literary production was done through other tools, for example, Python scripts. And you also mentioned earlier that you also teach Python. And do you favor a widespread use of coding? Like, do you favor also a low threshold skill level of coding?
I mean, the question would be for what purpose, right? I mostly teach Python in the context of kind of creative computing, and there I teach alongside random cut-ups, for instance. I mean, we always have a session on Brian Geison's cut-ups, that you take a newspaper and you cut it in 4 pieces, and then you rearrange the pieces and you get new text. So I'm mostly interested in programming in the context of creative production. So I wouldn't say everybody needs to program, or that this is a type of thinking that is absolutely necessary. It is a tool, and it is one that becomes increasingly available to people. So I want to make it available. Yeah.
You published a text, "Whoever controls language models controls politics." And there you make a claim for communization. I'd like to ask you to say a little bit more about that. Thank you.
I mean, a lot of these texts are kind of thought experiments that try to think something through to some kind of logical conclusion. And this one was basically the idea that language models, as producers of language, are also sites of political visions, in the sense that there is no neutrality when it comes to outputs and to language models. So for a while there was a discussion that I mean, it's still going on, because language models are fed on the bulk of language on the internet. They have strong biases that reflect certain prejudices. They're full of racism, sexism, etc. That is obviously a language model that has a certain ideology, that has a certain bias. It is not neutral. But I think the point I want to make is that every attempt at debiasing is itself ideological, right? It is the idea that we want to see a certain output. We want to have a certain a production of text that is itself the formulation of a social vision. In other words, there is neither in the kind of immaculate state nor in the debiased state any kind of neutrality in language models. And if you take that into account, then any language model itself is political to a very large degree. And if we have these kind of monopolization structures in the production of language models, then the question would be why is it a good idea to let private companies become the sites of the formulation of social visions? Right? It is in the end the question whether something like synthetic public spheres come into existence that are controlled by OpenAI or by Microsoft or by Meta or whatever. And if that is the case, an argument that basically is a Habermasian argument would say it would make sense to bring this back into a truly public forum that is one that is not controlled by private models, but rather by public models. And this is the idea of communization. That just the same way you want to break up certain media monopolies, you might want to break up the producers of language models. Right, not from an economic standpoint, but from one that has to do with the role of public communication.
And I think another question, also a political question, which surprised me when you talked about how we are reading Berlin, Miami, is this what makes us enjoy AI literature? And you described this feeling of a distrust, or because it is, as you also told, it is a surface text, so you never know really how to read it, how to understand it. And the way how you described it right now, I was wondering if that makes it also, in a way, an appropriate form of literature for our time. I mean, we would first argue it is an interesting form of literature for the technical reasons that right now we have these tools and somehow we have to understand them. So let's try to produce some literature to understand what these tools are doing and what effect they have. But if we really just change the position to that of a reader, is this form of distrust, which we also have in institutions right now in a lot of levels, and this kind of trying to make sense of a lot of information, is it already on that level, also on that level, maybe the contemporary literature of our time?
Maybe. I don't know if I want to go that far, because the difficult, or let's say, literature that on the surface seems nonsensical is obviously older than AI writing, right? If you can try to read certain text of the Nouveau Roman, actively undermines causality. If you read Gertrude Stein, there is also kind of this undermining of expectations going on. So this is not itself new, but I think that's why I usually frame this as an exploration of the technology. The kind of the underlying logic of the AI seems to be in line with a certain tradition of experimental writing, which I find quite interesting. However, I think that idea of an increased distrust and distance might, you probably could say that, but for the reason that I mentioned with post-artificial writing, right? That the inability to tell the value or the trustworthiness of something simply by identifying its origin becomes harder and harder. And that becomes harder partly in political discourse, but partly also because of the technologies that produce the text. So there might be a connection there, yeah.
Okay. Should we open up, or are there questions by the others, the audience? I mean, otherwise we can also continue. One other question I had is that is often discussed in regard to AI models is that whether they can produce something new. And there is this historical already, it is also not a new question. I think Ada Lovelace was the first who formulated that basically because everything that goes into the machine, nothing new can come out that wouldn't have been produced by humans the same way, very briefly. And I think Turing was the first Alan Turing was the first who disagreed. How would you describe, or what's your position on this kind of classical problem? Can machines produce something new, something post-human in a way?
I mean, I tend to agree with Turing simply for his argument is, or rather, Lovelace's argument is, if you are the one who sets down the rules, the machine does nothing. The machine simply executes the rules and therefore cannot produce anything new. And what Turing said was, well, but I'm and actually Strachey too, is that the awareness of the rules does not anticipate the outcome of the rules application. You can be surprised by your own rules, and if that happens, then apparently something new came into the world. And I think that's not wrong. I mean, I experience that all the time. I set up kind of a system that then makes something I didn't anticipate, and that pleases me. And I think this pleasure is pleasure of the new. At the same time, the machine doesn't really do much, right? I always have a difficulty ascribing machines agency. I mean, in a strong sense, in that I still have to do something with the resultant text. I have to publish it, or I have to edit it, or I have to declare it done, or something like that, so that I can mostly think of, and I think I'm pretty strict on that point. Mostly think of the machine as a tool that can only become socially active if its products are disseminated by someone with that status of a social agent, maybe a human. That this can become a very closely related assemblage between humans and machines, I think is also clear. But the machine itself on its own doesn't do anything. It can only do that in conjunction with the human. So the question whether machines can produce anything new in a way is moot, because the novelty of it can only be understood or acknowledged in conjunction with humans that acknowledge that. You know, there's I think thinking about machines as novelty producing is idealizing the status of the machine as autonomous, which it is not.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking if we can rephrase the question of the new, because I mean, if we have just surface text, you know, and
Yeah.
they don't have meaning in itself because they are just surface, then the question of the new anyway becomes a little bit weird or strange, maybe.
Yeah, I
Because
mean
it's the
that's
question what we read, what we see behind the surface.
yeah. Exactly. It comes back to the idea that there is a that we very often, even against Barton Foucault, need the assurance of meaning, even if all we have is the surface. It needs to be
Mhm.
at least plausible that it was meant to mean something.
So we have a question from the audience. So Andres is wondering if you think that the distinction between poetry and prose would be helpful for a reader of digital literature?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I've done both. I can answer this from the perspective of a writer of these things. I think that poetry is more lenient. It allows one to flaunt many more conventions than prose writing, right? So poetry is very much able to do without subjectivity, or subjects rather, and it is very much able to do without the type of coherence that is necessary for narration. So I think that also as vessels for meaning, I think poetry becomes very capacious. I don't know if it has a lot of explanatory power to discuss the kind of type of text that AI and computers produce, if that's what was meant by the question. And when you say would the distinction between poem and prose helpful for a reader of digital literature, well, what I read wasn't poetry, right? It was quite obviously a type of prose, even though it was not the prose that we usually would expect. So I'm not sure if that would be useful for kind of analyzing the output. Yeah.
So Andre, I think, is still typing. I
Yeah.
think he has a problem with his microphone. Is there another question, Karin, or?
One question, yeah, it's very interesting about machine. A question about the act of reading. If you're writing, your audience is a reading human person. But my question is more: does machine change the mind when the machine are reading, or can machine reading?
Can machines read in?
Yeah, or do they change the mind when machine are reading? That's my
I'm
question. What do you think?
I'm not sure. I don't think machines do read. I think that's a metaphor, right? Humans read.
That's my question. Yeah, yeah.
And that's my answer. I don't think machines read. I think that
Okay.
is one of the anthropomorphisms that we say when machines have memory, they read things and so on. That it's a type of processing data. I think that is not comparable to humans. And I think I got a little more cautious on this point the more I read computer science. People talk about what language models do. I read the New Yorker had a terrible article, I think last issue, where a computer scientist was describing what his newborn son is doing to an LLM. Like basically, my son is learning next token prediction. I think that is an absolutely idiotic way to think about it. There might be very broad structural similarities, but I think it is not helpful in any way to do that. I mean, in this way, the metaphor goes the other way, but um, I think it's also interesting because what the output of that, or the result of that information processing is, can be read, but is in itself not really text, right? Or it's text, but it's not language. I think that's another thing. What interested me about putting 4 different novels into a fine tuning, or using it as a fine tuning set, is that their inherent coherence is kind of exploded because it suddenly no longer exists in kind of one world, in one space, right? It is not that the characters from one novel now can also appear in the world of the other novel, but rather that the world is a structure of coherence of all these novels is kind of exploded, which I think has something to do with exactly the type of reading that happens in the producing of a vector model, because it's not reading; it is something else.
Okay, we're slowly running out of time, but I think maybe Mark, do you have another question because you switched on your camera?
Yes, I have one. One of the characteristics of digitality is the dynamic thing, that it's dynamic, that it can change all the time. So did you do some experiments with the dynamic aspect of digitality, in the dynamic text that they interacts with the reader or
Yeah.
somehow?
No, and this is a very conscious decision. I think it's the way I came to digital literature was kind of in the aftermath of hypertext of the 1990s, which put a premium on interactivity and exactly this dynamic element. And this is just a matter of taste, but for me, this was kind of over in a way, or these kind of experiments had been made, and I was very interested in static text, exactly the generative aspect, which is also why I like books. I like the output medium of the book, which is with OXOA, we use print on demand books as kind of the carrier medium, because to my mind, interactivity was kind of this maybe a red herring a little bit.
Yes, thank you.
But again, this is
Okay.
completely subjective.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I believe it's slowly time to close.
So thanks, Hannes, for joining us today. Thanks everybody for coming, and I think you have, it's still morning in California, so you have still your day ahead. We have evening here, it's dark. Thanks also, Stephanie, for joining me here. And so the last thing what I can point to is that we will have one more talk in this series, which will be on January 16th with Victoria Ivanova from the Serpentine Galleries in London, where we will talk about infrastructure and AI. So thanks a lot. Bye.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.